Eleanor Whitaker was 20 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. On the morning of June 14, 1969, in a steel and laminate office above a Stockton hardware store, her uncle set a check on the desk between them, the figure written in his careful italic hand. $487.40. He did not sit her down. He stayed standing, one hand on the inkwell, the other tucked flat against his belt as if rehearsing a posture for some later photograph. On her person she carried her father's brass surveyor's compass in the right-hand pocket of her mother's wool cardigan, the glass face cool against her hip. She had, 3 days earlier, walked the half-mile from the Greyhound station to look at a sun-bleached stagecoach depot far out in the Nevada high desert, a ruin she could not afford. Listed for $1 more than she had in her savings account. What nobody knew, not even the county clerk who would file her deed, was that buried under the half-collapsed hayloft of that very depot, for 120 years. A single Conestoga wagon had lain packed with the belongings, the letters, and the last legal tender of a doomed 49ers caravan. Settle in wherever you are tonight, friend, and tell me the name of the town you sit in. This is the story of Eleanor Margaret Whitaker, and of the wagon they were never supposed to find. Eleanor had been raised between two ways of seeing the world, and she carried both of them in her hands. Her father, Ezra Whitaker, had been a transit man, a surveyor who walked mountain ranges for the Bureau of Reclamation in the late 1950s, and from the time she was 6 years old he had taught her the elegant logic of a machine. He smelled of graphite and gun oil and cold coffee. His voice was low and patient, his hands, when he laid them across a topographic sheet, were still as sequoias. He had taught her to read a triangle the way other fathers taught their daughters to read a hymnal, through 3 angles, 3 legs, 1 exact answer. On his desk at the cabin near the Inyo grade, beside a tin of transit oil and a roll of manila drafting tape, sat a brass surveyor's compass the size of a woman's palm, made in Stuttgart in 1911. With a hinged mirror and a needle that never quite settled. A map, he had told her the week before he went into the tunnel that killed him, is just a story that hasn't happened yet. The compass doesn't lie, Ellie. It just tells you which way the story is going. He had dropped the brass case into her palm as he zipped his jacket. 6 months later, in October 1965, 2,000 tons of dolomite relieved him of his story. She was 16. He was 41. The compass had not moved from her right hip since. The other half of Eleanor had been given to her by her mother, Lillian, who died of bronchial pneumonia in the winter Eleanor turned 7. Of Lillian she remembered almost nothing except a scent, the dried lavender her mother kept in a porcelain swan on the dresser, and the way she had pressed her thumb to Eleanor's temple in the dark when she could not sleep. Then came Uncle Tobias, her father's younger brother, a man who read nothing but ledger books and who smelled, if he smelled of anything at all, of starched cuffs and indifference. He had taken Eleanor in not from love but from duty, in the same spirit one writes a column for charity on a tax return, an obligation, a receipt, a line item. Line item 17, in fact, household dependents other than spouse or blood. He kept her fed, schooled, clothed in clean cotton, and absolutely invisible. By day Eleanor learned the language of Tobias's world, accounts, double entry, the silent arithmetic of profit and loss, by night, in the small bedroom behind the kitchen. She studied her father's survey texts and reread, in the same leather-bound compass case, the one letter Ezra had written to her on her 9th birthday, asterisk, compass first, answer second. The land doesn't move, we do. Asterisk on June 14, 1969, her cousin Meredith was married in a Baptist church in Stockton, and Uncle Tobias, having escorted his only daughter to the altar in oyster taffeta, came back to the office above the hardware store with his tie still slightly twisted. He stood across the walnut desk from Eleanor and explained, in the measured cadence of a man reading minutes, that with the nuptials concluded his household had narrowed and his ledger accordingly shortened. He did not sit her down. He did not raise his eyes from the blotter. A man of my years, Ellie, he said, and it was the first time he had called her anything but, the girl, requires an economy. Meredith has gone to Reno. My sister-in-law, bless her, begins next Tuesday in the bookkeeping room, and the guest room is no longer mine to lend. He slid the check forward with 2 fingers. $487.40. Generous, I think, considering we took you in for 7 years, through high school, through the funeral costs your father couldn't pay, through the whole of it. Cleared account, Ellie. We shall speak at Christmas, as we always have. Eleanor looked at the check, then at his starched cuff, then at the framed photograph of Meredith on the credenza, a photograph in which she saw now for the first time, she herself did not appear. Thank you, Uncle Tobias, she said quietly, and she folded the check into the compass case and left without raising her voice. She packed that evening, the compass, 2 pairs of cotton stockings, the lavender-scented cardigan that had been her mother's. A copy of Menashe's topographic manual she had bought second-hand for 60 cents, and a chipped enamel mug with a chip in the rim that fit her thumb. She slipped the photograph of Meredith out of the credenza on her way past the door and tucked it back into its place, face down. Then she closed the front door of the house she had lived in for 7 years so softly that the latch barely kissed the strike plate. The compass weighed 3 ounces against her hip. From Stockton she took the Greyhound east across the Sierra at 5:30 in the morning, her ticket paid for with $3.40 of the settlement. The bus smelled of diesel fuel, vinyl seats, and the cigar of a man 2 rows back who did not open his window. She changed at Reno, where the depot was already loud with copper miners on the night shift. And there she ate a bowl of ham and bean soup and a slice of bread for 15 cents before boarding the once-a-day pickup truck that ran south through the high desert toward the ghost stage stops. Along the old emigrant trail. The road was gravel, then washboard, then 2 ribbons of dust that the tires threw up against the wheel wells of the Ford. She sat between a young Basque sheepherder who never spoke and an elderly woman who carried a brown paper parcel of seeds as if it were an infant. Inside her shirt pocket, her father's Maxim sat warm against her sternum. One cannot truly lose what one was never permitted to keep. 43 miles south of the junction she noticed a flyer thumbtacked to the back of the seat, sun faded, the ink runneled at the edges. Advertising an estate sale. Estate of the late Lottie Brennick, Lastwater, Nevada, including the big depot and all appurtenances, back taxes owing, she did not know, on that washboard road. Why the word Lastwater caught in her chest the way the word belonging once had. But she folded the flyer twice and put it in her pocket next to the letter. Lastwater lay at the end of the road the way a forgotten ledger entry lies at the bottom of a file, at the bottom of the road because no one had bothered to remove it. 12 buildings, low and sun-bleached, pressed along a single dust street, a post office whose flag had not been raised since 1953, a filling station with 2 pumps and no attendants. A cafe with both windows cracked, a chapel whose bell rope had been cut. The defining note of the place was absence. The Carson River, which had once run a yard deep through the center of town, had not run since the Newlands project of 1907. The ditch that had carried it was a dry chalk scar. The hand-painted sign at the town line read ELEV, 4,302 feet, POP 38, and the 38 had been repainted from 87 in 1948. And there, at the east end of the dust street, where a hitching post had once stood beside a watering trough, rose the big depot, 68 feet long, 2 full stories and a gable. Whitewashed pine clapboard with a hand-painted false front, and behind it a soaring hay barn whose cantilevered roof had half collapsed in 1949 and never been raised since. The clapboards peeled like sunburned skin. A pair of iron-bound freight doors, 10 feet tall, hung at jaunty angles from a single surviving hinge. It was absurd, magnificent, utterly abandoned, and as Eleanor stood at the hitching post with the compass in her hand and the wind lifting the dust off her shoes, she recognized it. Without quite understanding how she did, as a mirror of herself. A forgotten line item. Just like her. The county clerk of Lastwater, Esmeralda County, sat in the post office because Lastwater did not have a courthouse. He was a small, dry man of 53 named Phineas, and he looked up from a Sears catalog with the polite disbelief of someone greeting a customer who had wandered into a tomb by accident. "You're the girl," he said, by way of greeting, adjusting his reading spectacles on a pin of nose cartilage. "Saw your name on the Greyhound manifest somebody radioed in this morning. They don't send a girl out here alone to look at the depot." "I am," Eleanor said. "Walk with me," he said, and walked her 2 blocks east at a pace that announced itself as a daily constitutional. The depot, he explained in the tone of a man reciting weather data, had stood since 1878, 28,000 board feet of ponderosa pine hauled in by the Overland Stage Company, abandoned since 1931 when the route was bypassed by the Lincoln Highway. Left standing because no one had the money to tear it down and no one had the heart to watch it fall. Back taxes, certificate of sale, water lien, and accumulated penalty, up to and including the second quarter of 1969, $312.17. The figure, he said with a small wince, was one of his prouder pieces of arithmetic. Eleanor opened the compass case, set her uncle's check on the desk, and asked whether she might pay the remainder in cash. She had, by her father's pencil, exactly $312.17 remaining. Phineas's eyebrows rose and, for the first time in perhaps 40 minutes, formed the suggestion of a smile. He sanded the ink slowly off a rubber stamp, blew a fine dust of mauve pigment into the brass shell, and pressed the deed onto a half-sheet of brittle linen bond. He touched a wafer of red sealing wax to the desk candle, then the gleam of it into the soft fissure of the paper. The wax hardened into the shape of Lastwater County, Enton, 1969. He gave her 1 key, 3 keys in fact, on a length of binder twine, and a dry, "Good luck, Miss Whitaker. You have bought yourself the biggest roost in the county." She opened the iron-bound doors with the 3 keys, and the depot gave her back its smell, 50 years of dust thick as a blanket. Dry as talc, fine enough to settle on the tongue. It was cooler inside than out, the way cellars are cooler, and darker. The false front had been painted with only 1 coat of primer to begin with. And half the second-story windows still held their glass, clouded to a milky sunstruck gray. She walked the long room on the ground floor first, boot heels loud, the boards ringing under her weight, a clerk's desk with a swivel stool. A freight scale whose brass pan ran the length of her forearm, a brace of pigeonholes still labeled Reno, Virginia City, Belmont, Hawthorne, Carson. The destination's ink faded to the color of weak tea. She climbed the staircase to the second floor, for steps, a landing, for steps again, into the old waiting room, where a lithograph of Yosemite still hung, cracked across the valley. Beside a row of hat pegs and a brass spittoon polished by nothing but the labor of the wind. Then, by a door at the rear whose lock had been broken before she was born, she pushed through into the hay barn. The barn was the soaring one. 60 feet long, 60 feet deep, the half-collapsed north roof had shed its rain and snow into a single gray pile at the center, mounded 5 feet high. And emerging from the top of that pile, pulled, by some older gravity than gravity, out of the dust and the felted hay and the pigeon-matted cellulose, rose the high canvas-hooped ribs of a Conestoga wagon. She walked toward it on instinct, the way a compass turns north, the way a ferry turns into a current. The wagon was immense, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide at the bed, the iron tires orange with rust but the canted hickory bows still standing in their sockets like the ribs of some immolated bird. The wood, she saw when she brushed the dust from the rear gate, was fundamentally sound. It was, she understood, a home waiting to be awakened. She chose the southwest corner of the waiting room as her first habitable square, 12 feet by 12, with 2 windows that still held glass and a potbelly stove as old as the cataclysm of 1906. Its cast-iron belly still flew clean on the inside. She swept the floor for 1 hour and 40 minutes, dragging against the grain with a salvaged push broom, lifting dust into the slant of the window light until it hovered like a yellow veil. She heaved 2 of the fallen boards back into their joists with a borrowed wrecking bar. She replaced 3 of the window panes with squares of salvaged glass from the chapel, the chapel had given up its windows first. She primed the stovepipe joint with newspaper and lit the first fire at 4:20 on the afternoon of her third day in residence. The flue drawing clean after 11 careful swings of the damper. Water she brought up the dust road from the artesian spigot at the Traveler's Rest, 2 5-gallon cans a day, balanced on the flatbed of an offering truck driven by Virgil Kemp, who had said nothing but "Mornin'" on the first trip, "Thank you, Miss Whitaker," on the second, and "You were Ezra's girl," on the third, in that order. She rationed the cans, 2 cups for cooking, 2 cups for washing, half a cup for drinking, half a cup for the floor. The first fire caught on the 8th match. The first hot meal, a can of condensed tomato soup, a heel of bread Inez Drave had slipped under the door that morning. The bread still warm, she ate at the swivel stool with her father's compass set at the right-hand corner of the desk. A small pocket of civilization lit against the long desert dark. The half-collapsed hayloft of the barn held a sealed trap, a square hatch set into the standing wreckage of the loft floor, 10 feet above the dirt of the barn. Painted over in 1940 by a hand that had whispered, "No entry," along its edges in white chalk that had since vanished. The hatch was locked with a pin tumbler of a kind her father had taught her to defeat on long summer afternoons when she was 11, with a hairpin and a bent paperclip and a great deal of patience. She tried it for 93 minutes on the evening of her 4th day. The hairpin bent in the 2nd ward. The paperclip snapped in the 3rd. The lock held, and she sat on the loft beam with her wrists aching and her pride a little smaller, and she understood, with a small and bitter smile, that even her father had not been able to pick what he had not been able to study. The second method required patience and a borrowed screwdriver from Virgil's truck and 4 hours measured out in cold sweat. She unscrewed the hinge pins one by one, marking each with a chalk tick on the wall, supporting the hatch with her shoulder against the gale of the loft wind. Her knuckles split against the old wood. Her arms trembled twice. The hinge pins came free at 8:05. The hatch opened. A breath of air came up out of the wagon beneath, hot and dry and scented with 120 years of preserved dust and the faint, mineral memory of alkali and pinion pitch. And at the center of that breath was the wagon itself, the one buried by the doomed 49ers of the previous century, and she was the first living person in 120 years to set eyes on its load. Under the wagon's slatted bed, lashed against a transverse oak crossbrace with a leather thong that still held, she found a leather-bound logbook the size of a missile. Its spine tooled and blind with the year 1923, the cover soft with the oils of 100 human thumbs. The first page was entitled in a careful clerk's hand, Ezekiel V. Holcomb, Station Master, Lastwater Depot, 1898-1943, **** Ezekiel had been 26 when he took the posting, and he had stayed 45 years. The entries were short, clipped, written in a hand that had grown crooked with age, *12 March 1923, wagon uncovered in collapsed loft by J. Stroud, prospecting. Bound for Death Valley in 49, reburied for posterity, ** 14 July 1929, drought continues. Ration of well water to 2 gallons per day, ** 8 October 1937, Rebecca buried at the chapel. May gone to Reno, ** 3 February 1943, last entry. Standing guard until the Lord calls, ** The entries slid downhill like water on a slope. As Eleanor knelt on the loft beam with the logbook in her hands, she noticed, with her father's instinct for false floors, for the second board under the third, the third under the fourth, that the central slat of the wagon's bed rang hollow when she tapped it. She pressed her ear to the wood. She tapped again. Hollow as a struck drum. She pressed the concealed latch in the third iron nail from the west. The bedboard rose, on a single bronze piano hinge, and beneath it lay a tin strongbox with 2 hasps and a single sheet of folded paper. Inside the strongbox lay 3 objects, wrapped in oilskin that was still supple to the touch. The first was a bundle of $211.40 in California Gold Country coin of the 1850s, 21 Eagle half dollars in a chamois pouch. The metal still as bright as Eleanor had ever seen a $50, the dates 1853, 1854, 1855, the modest reserve the wagon's last driver had meant to carry out of Death Valley and never did. The second was a leather spectacle case containing a wire-rimmed monocle, the lens clouded by a century of heat and a case embossed in gold with the initials J.M. P***, and, in faded ink along the spine, the words Captain Jonathan Meeker Pinckney, Ledger of the Silver Column. The third was a folded letter sealed with a wafer of red wax long since cracked, addressed in a fine copperplate hand to whomsoever finds the second wagon, that letter. She read by the light of a carbide lamp she had borrowed from Arno Hessel that morning, was written by Captain Jonathan himself on the eve of his walking out of the desert to die alone in 1849. Entrusting to the buried wagon, to the wagon and nothing but the wagon, the final accounting of the silver column, his daughter's last letter home. And his prayer that whoever had the patience to dig for what had been hidden, instead of looking for the wealth above ground, should inherit it. Let him find the wagon, and the wagon shall find him, the captain had written in the third paragraph, in a script so steady it looked back at the desert. Ezekiel had appended his own letter to the dead captains. His hand was smaller, less confident, and it trembled at the edges of the long S's the way a hand trembles when it has not been held by another for several seasons. Miss or Mr., if you are reading this, you have done a thing that 4 generations of Holcombs and 3 generations of Lastwater could not bring themselves to do. You have opened the wagon. You have read the captain's letter. You have looked at the wagon not as a curse but as a bequest, my wife May took Rebecca west to Reno in '37. She took the measles with her. I stayed because I had promised Captain Pinckney, in the reading of a book the captain never wrote, that somebody would one day come to Lastwater with the patience to find value in what everyone else abandoned. I am 71, and the Lord has not yet called. He will. Soon. Take the $211.40. Spend it on the wagon's restoration. Spend it on the depot's restoration. Spend it on the roof and the stovepipe and the glass in the windows. Spend it on yourself only that you may stay long enough to do the work. Do not let Lastwater die before Captain Pinckney's wagon is open to the sky. Eleanor read the letter twice. She set it on the desk beside her father's compass, with her mother's lavender-scented cardigan folded beneath it. One was a guide to the land, she thought. The other was a reminder of a man who was brave enough to die alone. She understood, then, that she had never bought a ruin. She had accepted a commission. She walked the dusty street of Lastwater the next morning with a pencil and the back of an old envelope, and by mid-morning she had the bones of a plan. The depot would be re-roofed, re-glassed, re-plumbed by hand. The ground floor would become a roadhouse, dry lodging for stagecoach replica travelers, jerry-rigged cyclists, weekend hunters from Reno, a small general store for the 12 families still living. The waiting room upstairs would become a workshop, her father's workshop, where she would repair surveyors' instruments and travelers' clocks and the broken things that no one else in Esmeralda County knew how to mend. The barn wing would become a museum, Captain Pinckney's wagon, the contents of the strongbox, the logbook, the monocle, the gold, all of it, displayed honestly. With dust in its place and a card that explained why. She drew up the supply list on a piece of tin, 42 sheets of 4x8 plywood at $1.85 each, 16 2x4s, 6 gallons of red barn paint, 2 pounds of roofing nails. A roll of 15-pound felt, a coil of copper plumber's tape, 4 panes of salvaged glass, a case of clamps, 3 pounds of welding rod, a hand-crank drill. She walked the list down to McGee's Hardware in the Ford pickup belonging to Arno Hessel, who had heard about the purchase from Virgil, who had heard it from Phineas Ott, and whose laughter, when she read the list aloud, was generous and not unkind. "Reasonable list, Miss Whitaker," he said. "Reasonable put together." By sundown, 3 of Lastwater's 8 business owners had stopped her in the street to ask, with various gradations of incredulity, whether she meant it. She started where her father had taught her to start, at the roof. With Virgil Kemp's borrowed tool belts and 42 sheets of plywood lashed to the flatbed, she spent the first 3 weeks of July refelting the depot's south gable. Climbing up and down the borrowed extension ladder with the discipline of a woman who had learned at her father's knee that a roof is the first page of any story. She chalked each shingle line on a piece of slate the night before. She snapped each chalk line at dawn. She wore leather gloves that turned her knuckles white. The shingles went down in straight ranks, 8 nails each, the exposure set to 4 7/8 inches. Then she moved inside, to the weatherproofing, caulking the depot's original 28 window frames with a hand-mixed putty of boiled linseed and whiting. Working from the top of the building to the bottom, opening each sash, prying out the brittle sash cord, fitting new cotton sash line. Reglazing each pane with hand-cut squares of glass she had scored from larger salvage. Then she turned to the iron-bound freight doors, the 10-foot pair at the gable end, which had hung from one hinge since 1949. She and Arno Hessel, a welder of 33 whose mother had known Ezra in the Inyo grade, spent 11 days restoring them, new pintles forged by hand. Hinge leaves rebolted to the post with 7-inch lag bolts, hasps welded, an old stage route bell cord restrung through the eye at the top of the right-hand door so that it would ring, faintly, when the wind was right. They rang it together, the first time, on a Tuesday in August. She remembered the sound all winter. Virgil Kemp was 64, a cattleman turned carpenter who had not walked past the depot in 22 years because Lastwater's last carpenter had been his brother. Killed in '57 under a barn-raising beam. He had walked in, the morning after the re-roofing began, with a measuring tape and a critical eye and a question that sounded like a test: what's the miter angle on a 5/12 pitch? Miss Whitaker. 22 6/10 degrees, she had answered, and Virgil had sat down on an upturned nail keg and looked at her with the slow, startled expression of a man who had been handed something by accident and was not yet sure whether to keep it. He offered nothing for 3 weeks but his nail keg. Then, on a Tuesday in the second week of August, he offered her the use of his father's old hand saw and a length of hardwood for the depot's newel post. By September he was teaching her how to cut a dovetail by eye, and she was teaching him, in return, how to read a topographic slope. Inez Drave was the baker, 51, the widow of a Dutch-German mechanic who had kept the town's only working oven since 1937. Beginning on the 4th day of Eleanor's residence, Inez had left, with no word spoken, a brown paper parcel on the depot's freight step every morning at 6:15, bread the first week. Bread and a slice of bacon the second, bread and a small crock of stew by the third. She had not knocked. She had not explained. By October, when Eleanor finally went to the bakery to thank her, Inez had only said, "You were Ezra's girl. I knew it from the way you hold your wrist." Arno Hessel was the youngest and the most difficult. He had been a welder, then a bartender, then a welder again. He had known Eleanor's father the way a young man knows the father of a girl he will not meet for 30 years, by reputation, by the forge marks on the south door of his mother's house, by the temper of his drill bits, which Arno now kept, by permission, on the wall above his own anvil. He had seen the forge marks on Eleanor's battered tin of nails, and he had said, "That's Ezra's set. Show me your hand." He had inspected the way she held the hammer, then, by way of acceptance, set his own hammer down beside it. "I'll come in at sunrise tomorrow," he said. "Don't be late." These were not friendships in the conventional sense. They were a town built back together, one nail at a time. Months turned into a year the way a story turns into a sequel, slowly, then all at once. By the second summer, the depot's false front had been scraped and repainted the color of eggshell, the freight doors swung true on their new hinges. The loft hatch had been dismantled and rebuilt and welded shut for the public, replaced by a small oak stairway and a brass handrail. The hay barn had been re-roofed in the same red as the depot gable, the hay pit at the center removed by a quarter so that the wagon's canvas arches stood clear of the new concrete pad. A small museum sign, painted by Inez's niece, read the Pinckney Wagon, a silver column inventory, 1849. The whole structure Eleanor began, by the third autumn, to call the Lastwater compass, a roadhouse, a surveyor's workshop, a museum, an inn. Townspeople and strangers gave Eleanor her nickname in the same week, without conferring. Miss Compass. She fixed the name in leaded glass above the depot door in November of 1970. The first three notable guests she would always remember: a soil engineer from Berkeley who had driven down on the rumor of the wagon, a Spanish-named cyclist who had walked his bicycle across the desert for 2 days to reach her door, and a Texas-born widow of 78 who had ridden the Lincoln Highway through Lastwater 52 years before and who had wept, quietly and without embarrassment, when she had read Captain Pinkney's letter. She had stayed 3 days and paid in cash and left a quarter-horse blanket folded on the newel post. Now, on a Tuesday in late September of the second full year of operation, of the porch bell ringing, of the surveyor's lamp lit at 6 every morning, Eleanor walked the day the way her father had taught her to walk a slope, by hand, by sight, by measure. At sunrise she milked the gauge by the loft window. At 7 she unlocked the freight doors for Inez, who arrived at 20 past with 2 loaves of sourdough wrapped in a checked cloth and a jar of plum preserves. At 8, Arno arrived from his own forge up the road, by way of the southeast service door, to rehang the second-story storm sash she had removed for the winter. At 9, Virgil arrived with his apprentice, a boy of 14, the first child of Lastwater in 9 years, to begin the long, patient work of teaching him, by eye and by hand, how to read a dovetail. At noon she sat at her father's swivel stool in the workshop, with her father's compass set into a small wooden notch she had carved into the corner of the desk. And she ate a bowl of stew Inez had brought, and children from the dormitory 3 miles east arrived by school bus to be shown, in shifts, the wagon at the center of the barn. She passed to each of them, in turn, her father's hand-me-down maxim, by way of a small wooden card she had printed at the Reno print shop, compass first, answer second. The land doesn't move, we do, the depot had become, by any honest ledger, the social and economic heart of the town. On the third Tuesday of October, in the second full year, after a thunderstorm that had rolled in across the Washoe Range and laid down a quarter-inch of rain on the new roof, Eleanor sat alone in what had been the hayloft trap room and was now her private office. The brass compass her father had given her on the day he had walked into the tunnel sat on the left corner of the desk, its needle still restless between 2 points of the constellation. Light spilling across its glass face the way light had spilled across it the morning she had packed it into the compass case 3 years ago. Beside it, on the right corner, sat Captain Pinkney's wire-rim monocle in its leather case, the lens still clouded by 121 years of heat and rent, the initials J.M. P*** still legible along the spine. She did not touch either of them. They sat, between them, as 2 halves of a single story, a surveyor's reading and a captain's last accounting, and she understood, finally, that the 2 halves had been the same thing all along. She thought of Uncle Tobias then. She thought of his starched cuffs, his walnut desk, his check written in italic hand. She did not, she discovered, feel any of the bitterness she had expected she would feel. She felt, instead, a kind of gratitude that surprised her. He had given her, with the very callousness that had meant to dismiss her, the small season of homelessness that had permitted her to keep the appointment that Ezekiel had waited 70 years to fill. He had not known how little money he had actually given her. He had not known how much of a man he had been the instrument of. Her name was Eleanor Margaret Whitaker. She had been 20 years old on the morning of June 14, 1969. $312.17 lighter for the back taxes on a sun-bleached stagecoach depot at the end of a road in the high Nevada desert. She sat now, 3 years later, in the office her father had never seen, with her father's compass at her left hand and a captain's monocle at her right. And the depot she had bought was no longer a depot and the wagon she had uncovered was no longer a ruin, and Lastwater, Nevada, Pop. 38, elevation 4,302 feet. Had become, instead, a town with a school bus route again, with 2 new families in the dormitory, with a post office whose flag was raised every morning. With a cafe whose windows had been replaced. With a handbell in the loft rung every Sunday by a girl who had not yet been born when Eleanor Whitaker had walked off the Greyhound with a compass in her pocket and a country in her chest. She turned the lamp down low. She touched, lightly, the rim of the brass compass. She did not need its needle to know the direction she was going. It had been the best $312.17 she had ever spent. It had bought her more than a home. It had bought her a life.